So tonight we're going to talk about Albrecht Durer first, and then we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about 16th century classical art, in part because Durer is a good transition for sort of explaining what's happening as we're moving across time inside places outside of Italy, right? So we sort of have a narrative developed about what's been going on in Italy, which is progressing away from the initial Renaissance and this burgeoning of new ideas, and sort of demonstrating that these new ideas in the 16th century and the 1500s, especially the latter half of the 1500s, are no longer new. And you have Albrecht Dürer, who is coming up around the same time as somebody like Raphael. He was born in 1471 in Germany, and he was the third of 18 children. Only 3 of the 18 children survived into adulthood. So he was living at the same time as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and Donatello, only especially with someone like Donatello and Leonardo da Vinci, he's living towards the later end of their lives. So he's in a newer generation, more akin to Raphael's generation, right? So not yet reaching like the generation of Titian, and he is really part of the Renaissance and what's happening there. So as you can see, Durer paints a lot of self-portraits. He was the son of a goldsmith, and he was initially trained as a metal worker, which is one of the reasons why he ends up going into printmaking. So this process of engraving and etching is something that he easily transfers to the printmaking. He didn't start painting, well, I mean, this is still a young age, but he started painting in 1484, so when he was about 13 years old. This is a self-portrait of Albrecht Dürer at age 26. And there are a lot of portraits of Albrecht Dürer. He painted himself a lot. This is probably one of his most famous. This is Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait at age 28. He was very famous for his hair, which is something that's sort of interesting. They actually have locks of his hair that were preserved that are, I'm not sure which museum they're housed in, but you can go and look at locks of Albrecht Dürer's hair, who's very famous for it. He was, he thought well of himself, and he was a relatively handsome man. So one of the things that he had a tendency to do was to use himself as a subject a lot, which isn't all that unusual for Northern painting, but this painting in particular was unusual because he painted himself as Christ, right? So when we look at previous representations of artists putting themselves into the place of biblical characters, we look at like Michelangelo's flayed skin of Saint Bartholomew. So there's a measure of humility that exists inside some of these men, which doesn't exist for Dürer. So this is a portrait of Albrecht Dürer's wife, Agnes. He had an arranged marriage to her. Her name was Agnes Frey, and both his dad and her dad had been metalsmiths, and this is sort of how they arranged the marriage. She came with a dowry of 200 florins. Albrecht Dürer and Agnes Dürer had no children. They were both Protestant Christians, so this was not necessarily unusual in the North. There was a movement towards Protestantism that was beginning to arise and would culminate in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation and the theses of Martin Luther, which occurred during Dürer's lifetime. But the thought despite the fact that this is a little bit earlier, the thoughts that led to the Protestant Revolution or Protestant Reformation, are taking place during this time. So much of his artwork deals with Christian themes. And he believed that his artistic ability was a gift from God. So even though he wasn't necessarily humble in his person or humble about his talent, he did give credit to God for what he was able to do. So he's most famous for making, for both his painted portraits, which he did primarily for rich people, aristocrats, right? And he's also famous for his prints, which were made available to the middle class through woodcut prints, right? So he became a person who would, for the first time, not make art that was necessarily based on commission, but he would make pieces. He would make these drawings, and then he would make these woodcut prints from these drawings, and then he would produce a run of them and travel from place to place and sell these prints at a relatively inexpensive cost to the middle class, enabling art to be sort of distributed. I mean, fine art to be distributed among the masses. Several of his woodcut plates still exist today, so you can still print from them, which is really kind of cool. But the nice thing about woodcut prints was that they allowed an image to be multiplied thousands of times, right? So you would do one woodblock print, and then you would create prints from it, and then you could distribute it, pretty much as long as the woodcut remained intact. This caused problems for Albrecht Durer in a way as well, because people would get a copy of his print and they would make their own woodcut from the print, and then they would reprint Albrecht Durer's work and um, create their own editions of it. So this became an instance in which artists began to more regularly sign their work, because one of the things that happened was that Albrecht Dürer had created a logo for himself, which had an A and a D, and was put into his prints. And when people made copies of his prints, he sued, and when it went to court, they said, well, you know what? They can reprint your prints, but they can't reproduce your signature. So that signature on that image, because so many people reproduced and copied from paintings, and woodcuts were a relatively new process for use during this time. So this idea that he owned his signature at least put a differentiation of value on an original print of Durer's. So this is Albrecht Durer's portrait of Michael Wohlgemuth. Michael Wohlgemuth was his teacher, taught him how to paint. There's a similarity in looking at this in terms of color and execution for me in looking at the portraits of Van Gogh. So a very similar sort of layer of expression and psychology that I think is present inside his work. So he was very well educated, more along the lines of a person like Leonardo da Vinci. So when we think about the term Renaissance man, somebody like Durer or da Vinci is generally who we're thinking of. He wrote books on scientific theory and math. This was one of the points that was brought up inside Damish's conversations, was that there had been a connection between discoveries in science and art prior to the Renaissance, way back in Greek and Roman art, and then there was a loss of some of these ideas. Like, so art was related to geometry and developments in geometry, as well as developments in art. They worked in tandem, right? So we have a tendency to sort of separate art from science and from math, but really the two things are interrelated. He was considered by many to be one of the greatest mathematicians of his time. So Philip II of Spain received a live rhino from India, and this was one of the first live rhinoceros seen in Europe since Roman times. So in a lot of ways, the rhino was considered to be almost mythological to Europeans. And the King of France wanted to see it. So the rhino was sent by boat in 1516. The ship wrecked, and the rhino went down with the boat. Durer had made a drawing of this rhinoceros from another artist's drawing, and his woodcut copy of it became very famous, and a lot of people purchased it. And even though this drawing was incorrect, it was considered to be a true representation until late into the 18th century. So Albrecht Durer was also considered to be a master at painting and drawing hands. So most artists would keep hands out of the picture, whereas Albrecht Dürer made people's hands an important part of his work. So you can see this particularly in this piece, Christ Among the Doctors from 1506, right? It's like smack dab in the center of the painting is a definite display of his skill in creating hands. This is Albrecht Dürer's praying hands from 1508. And Albrecht Dürer's hands with Bible. You can see the layer of intricate sense of flesh that he is able to execute. Just the molding of the hand in light and in shadow is pretty amazing. Okay, so we're talking a little bit about we're going to talk a little bit about symbolism. This is something also that's mentioned inside the readings for this week. So we talk about sort of a critique of iconology that sort of removes critical analysis from the process, right? So thinking of something that's more clinical and more based on a like word association or free association sort of situation. This relates very heavily to Albrecht Dürer's work, because Albrecht Dürer is very specifically drawing upon some ideas. So when we're representing things with symbols, something that we need to remember are the artist's intention in executing, right? So we can change the meaning of a work by interpreting it a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that was the artist's intention. So we need to be careful when we're doing that. We may be wrong rather than developing new strategies for understanding. So Albrecht Dürer created a book called The Apocalypse. This is The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This is from 1490. And it was the first book that was both designed and published solely by an artist. It contained a series of woodcut prints that showed scenes from the book of Revelation. So he very clearly used symbolism in his work. So you have colors, the colors white, black, red, and pale symbolize false peace, blood spilled in battle, black barren fields, and death and decay, et cetera, et cetera. So you can look through this a little bit. But he's using visual imagery to sort of equate things. So this is Albrecht Dürer's young hair. Something that's important about Dürer's work is that we need to remember that Dürer, in addition to having great skill and talent, also had help as well. So we have a tendency to think about art as being like this process of us learning to do everything out of our own labor and create these really amazing things, thinking that the work in doing so is where the value is. That's something that we need to rethink, right? Because usually, I mean, most artists from the probably mid-Renaissance, when the technology became available, through the present day have been using lenses and tricks and techniques in order to make an image appear more substantial. So that's something we need to remember. Durer used a grid to create his paintings. He would set up the space that he was looking at and grid it out inside and